Good morning, and thank you very much to FINA for the invitation and opportunity to present this research. And we also very much acknowledge and respect the untimely passing of Fran Crippen, which undoubtedly was the catalyst to stimulating the search for more evidence base towards answering that question, how hot is too hot for open water swimming? And we also acknowledge and declare that we have no conflict of interest other than receiving funding for the research from the ITU, the IOC Medical Commission, and FINA. So I'll just provide some quick background. Carl will go through our study. Carl did most of the work in the study. And then I'll just address some potential countermeasures. And another really interesting area that's emerging at the moment is the benefits of actually hot water immersion. So we may address that if we want to, or if people want to talk about it, maybe in the breaks or anything later. So in terms of a practical context, clearly athletes open water swimming at various profiles and various waterways and in water temperatures and over vastly different distances. And offsetting Fran Crippen's death, quite a few more deaths actually seem to happen in cooler water, so we can't forget that, and hence the importance of the next talk. And there may be actually multiple mediators and different mediators of those thermal injuries. And also, so now just to provide a physiological context, clearly water, there's much more heat transfer for a given water temperature difference than there is in air, hence, and that's due to its high conductivity and convectivity. So in neutral water at rest is 34 to 35 degrees, very close to core temperature, which is much closer than with air temperature of 27 degrees. And clearly when you swim, there's a vast increase in heat production, especially depending on fitness. But concomitantly, of course, there is with heat loss, and that's primarily through convection. And that results in very large individual differences. So some people can become hyperthermic and some people hypothermic in the same event. And sweating, which is now evolved major mechanism for heat transfer, is nullified in water. So given that people are going to be going into very different thermal states, then their behavioural temperature regulation becomes of paramount importance. And therefore, we need to know that that mechanism is intact. That behaviour is driven largely by thermally how you feel and how comfortable or otherwise you are with that perception. And we know that skin temperature, compared with the driving and autonomic thermoregulation, skin temperature is far more important in driving behavioural thermoregulation. And yet, comfortable skin temperature is about 33 degrees, which is what your temperature is now. But in warm water, that temperature is clamped at the comfort levels. And you can see with an experimental study there that core temperature at the top is absolutely flat, while people are able to behaviourally regulate between going from a cold room to a hot room. So when their skin temperature gets up to about 34, they choose to go to the cold room, and when it gets down to 28, they choose to go back to the hot room. So in that inter-threshold zone, they're comfortable. And therefore, if water is clamping their skin temperature at comfort, we need to know that they have a sense of how hot they really are. So that was a major stimulation to undertaking the research. So in the context of what the regulations were at the time, we need more evidence around the top end, hence we undertook a lot of research there, and we juxtaposed that against what would be, we considered, a relevant lower temperature, and we chose 20 degrees to compare it against based on relevance for FINA, but particularly the ITU. So that then determined that we were addressing 5 questions, 1, 3 and 5 of which we'll address today. Carl will address particularly 1 and 3. And that's the effect of open water swim distance and temperature on behavioural and autonomic thermoregulation, and particularly focusing on core temperature and performance capacity. Can individuals accurately perceive their own body temperature when they're swimming in warm water? And to what extent might we modulate that with adaptation prior to exposure? So I'll hand over to Carl.
Okay, so we had our subjects come into the lab, so all this work was conducted in the swimming flume at University of Otago. In the total, we end up with over 200 different swim performances of various durations and in different water conditions. For the warm water swims, we tried to simulate the open water environment by creating an indoor sun using some heat lamps located over the swimmers, and replicated some pretty similar intensities to you would get on the Earth's surface. We measured temperature mainly with a rectal thermistor, looked at heart rate, and recorded and also fed back things like time, distance, and velocity to the swimmers through an underwater TV screen, and also got them to answer their perceptions, like Jim was talking about, things like how hot they felt, how comfortable they were, so it didn't actually interrupt their swimming performances. And we could obviously control the water and the air temperatures within this environment as well as we could. So, onto the results. This is the core temperature results, or the rectal temperature. So you can see on the top we had basically a combination, or main combination, of 9 different conditions. So 3 swims in each of 20, 27, and 32 degree water, and we did distances of, or durations in this case, 20 minutes, 1 hour, and 2 hours in each of those different water temperatures. We also threw in an extra one over an hour and 30 degrees, just to get a bit of an interim point between those top 2 temperatures. So if we look here, we can see particularly the cold water swims, or the cooler water swims in the blue. Over 2 hours in particular, we can see that the numbers change because we only end up with 50% of the swimmers able to complete a 2-hour swim in 20 degrees. So only 4 of 8 were able to finish that swim, and that was mainly due to either extreme discomfort in the cold or their core temperature dropping to a pretty low temperature, down around or below 35 and a half degrees. If we compare that across to our warm water, so in the red, you can see that the core temperature obviously did rise, but the rise was very modest. So even across all 3 durations, the temperatures were, or the average temperature rise was to around 38 and a half degrees, which in terms of exercise for elite athletes is relatively modest. When we look at those temperatures as a function of their swimming pace, we can see there's no real obvious relationship. So on the bottom we have the average pace for each of the swims. This is all the individual swims we had, and the rectal temperature that those swimmers ended up with. So there's no obvious relationship between the fact that if you're a fast swimmer, so down the left-hand side of the graph, that you're likely to be the ones who get the highest core temperatures at the end. So there's no obvious relationship there. And when we look at that individually, we can see that the highest temperature recorded in any of these swims was only 39 and a half degrees, all right? And then even above 39, which some people might say is still quite warm, we only had 10 swims out of all those 200 plus that ended up over 39 degrees. On the flip side, down the bottom, if we look at 35 and a half degrees as a hypothermic cutoff point, we had at least 3 or 4 that were down around that range. The next part of the study, we sort of went to some local physicists at our university, and we looked at using the Whistler model, which is developed by Gene Whistler down in Texas, for modeling the thermal responses and seeing whether we can get more information using a computer modeling. And so this model uses, or splits the body up into a number of segments, and uses a lot of the literature on human thermoregulation and heat exchange to allow us to model what might happen in different conditions. So our physicists went and adapted this to be a bit more specific to swimming, and particularly the movements of swimming and the conditions. And we now have a model which seems to be quite well able to look at what's going to happen to different people in different conditions, whether we change the water conditions, the body composition of different athletes, how fast they're swimming, how fit they are, what clothing might be wearing, and things like that. So an example here of a simulation which is over 10 kilometers, a 10-kilometer swim, for example, in different water temperatures, and modeling the core temperature response that we might see. And when we look at those numbers, they match relatively similar to some of the data that we saw from our actual flume swims. As Jim mentioned, the perceptions, or the thermal behavior, or the thermal drive for behavior, is very important. And so what we have here is, on the left-hand side, the top one looks at the perceived body temperature, so thermal sensation, and the bottom Bottom left is the thermal discomfort of our swimmers across the different core temperatures. So what we see is as the core temperature rises, there's a positive linear relationship for both thermal sensation and thermal discomfort. So as the swimmers were getting hotter, in this case, they knew about it. They felt like they were getting warmer, and they felt more and more uncomfortable. So like one of the questions we had around the water temperature, holding people's skin temperature sort of constant and maybe affecting these perceptions, doesn't really seem to be the case. And when you look at the graph, you can maybe I see a grey line and a blue line and a purple line overlaid in there. They're stuff from some data we took on terrestrial athletes in our lab doing cycling and running exercise in a warm environment at similar skin temperatures. And so we can see that when we overlay that with the swimmers, the swimmers' responses are, if anything, maybe even more or higher than what we might see in a terrestrial athlete. So we can say that it seems that a swimmer is at no more risk of being or misinterpreting their body perceptions than a terrestrial athlete. And we see something similar on the right-hand side in terms of the overall feeling of the athlete, that there's a negative relationship. So as their body temperature got hotter or they got warmer, they started to feel worse and worse. Okay, their feelings went from good to bad. We had an honours student who also came in and helped collect some data on female athletes. So in the luteal phase of the female menstrual cycle, the core temperature is naturally a little bit higher. So we wanted to see whether that would cause an additional heat load when the swimmers are exercising in a warm environment. And over an hour swims, we saw no difference between that. So the response, especially the end temperatures, were similar regardless of the phase that the female swimmers were in. One thing that we took out of this is really a need for being a bit cautious in interpreting some of this data. So we use rectal temperature for most of our trials, but we did look at collecting esophageal temperature in a few of the swimmers. And so this is the result from one swimmer across the three 20-minute swims that they completed. The solid lines are their rectal temperature, and the open symbols is the esophageal temperature. And straight off we can see it's quite noisy, the esophageal temperature, which was interesting to us because it reflects the swimmer actually swallowing water. And so this swimmer actually told us, this is an elite international level triathlete, who said that they didn't think they swallowed much water when they swam, which is obviously doesn't seem to be the case. So that introduces a whole another set of problems possibly, especially for swimmers swimming in a very salty water environment possibly. But what is interesting is in the warm water, you can see the esophageal temperature in the red followed and tracked the rectal temperature pretty nicely. But in the blue, in the cool water, even though rectal temperature was largely unchanged, only dropped by less than half a degree, the esophageal temperature actually started, and that was after a 5-minute warm-up in 20 degrees, was already probably 1 or 2 degrees lower, and ended up right down to, even if we believe some of those points towards the end, which we do, maybe around 33, even 34 degrees core temperature. So we may have some issues around where we're actually measuring core temperature, whether it's rectally or esophageal. Similarly, this is another swimmer who recorded both. In a cool water swim for this is a larger swimmer, so has a greater body fat mass compared to the previous swimmer. The rectal temperature and the esophageal were quite well aligned. But when we look at their warm water swim over only 20 minutes, rectal temperature started to rise relatively slowly, but the esophageal temperature shot up quite quickly. So we're a little cautious in interpreting this because we might be getting a slightly mixed message for some swimmers at least, with different body shapes or fitness levels, etc. The next thing we looked at quickly was we used IFAB, intestinal fatty acid binding protein, as a marker of gut leakage and possibly how that might reflect a systemic inflammatory response during exercise. And what we see is the increase in IFAB was, or it did increase in both the neutral and warmer water conditions. But when we compare the bottom two graphs, the magnitude of that change was not really any different between the swimmers and what we have seen in previous study looking at exercising or terrestrial athletes running and cycling in our lab. So it doesn't seem that the increase we see with exercise in terrestrial athletes seems to be normal, and we see something very similar with the swimmers as well. So there don't seem to be any additional risk there either. In terms of performance, so what we've done here is across the 21-hour and 2-hour swims, we've normalized all the swims for each individual to how far they swam in the 27-degree conditions. So where the lines go up, the performance was slower or was worse, and where the lines go down, their performances were better. And so what we can see is that compared to 27 degrees, for 20 minutes and an hour at least, the performances were worse, as we might expect. But for 2 hours, in the 20-degree, particularly for those swimmers, remember half of them couldn't even finish 2 hours. For those swimmers that could complete the 2 hours, they actually went a little bit faster, or seemed to go a little bit faster in the 2-hour swims than they did in the 32-degree water. And in some ways, that might be representative of what we see in terrestrial athletes as well. So this is a previous work looking at marathon finishing times, and we can see that this is again performance decrement on the y-axis going up, and their time. So in each of those lines represents an increasing degree or increasing ambient condition, and so we can see that the faster performances in a marathon are typically occurring in cooler air conditions as well. Now, we also ran an additional study looking at wetsuit use. So in the cooler conditions, we thought we'd look to see whether wetsuits would have any effect. So we had 8 swimmers run through a 1.5-kilometre swim with and without a wetsuit in 22-degree water, so slightly warmer than what we used in the previous study. And we can see in the bottom graph here, so we're looking at our thermal discomfort. With the wetsuit in the red, there was that positive relationship where the swimmers were perceived or became more uncomfortable with the wetsuit on as they got warmer, but that relationship didn't exist when or was negated when they had no wetsuit. Okay. And then we look at the top with the adiposity, so how the larger swimmers, when they had the wetsuit on, or sorry, when they didn't have a wetsuit on, the larger swimmers felt or had a greater change in core temperature, where the ones that were skinnier, their core temperatures actually dropped and went down. And then again, with the wetsuit on, that relationship was lost, so that all swimmers actually had an increase in temperature with the wetsuit on. And what we see here is that on the x-axis here, this is the change in the core temperature for the swimmers when they had no wetsuit on, and then up on the y-axis is how much additional heat stress or how much additional core temperature change there was when they in addition to when they had the wetsuit on. So on the A and C on the right-hand side, they had the highest increase when they didn't have a wetsuit on, but when they put the wetsuit on, there was no additional rise. So they still heated up the same amount. Whereas on the left-hand side of the graph, B and E, their core temperatures actually dropped when they didn't wear a wetsuit, but when they put their wetsuit on, they were 1.5 degrees warmer, 1 to 1.5 degrees. So the wetsuit actually provided a good insulation or a good benefit to them in terms of maintaining their thermal balance. And lastly, until recently, it's been very difficult to look at measuring core temperature, particularly in a real-life or field environment. And so if we look at the bottom left graph here, this is a few data points we were able to collect from some actual 10K races in Hong Kong a few years ago. The black line that goes up top is one swimmer that we recorded during a race, the 10K race, which she swam in just over 2 hours. And we can see after 25 minutes, the core temperature seemed to spike up to 40 degrees and then maintain just below that for the rest of the race. That same swimmer actually conducted a test in our flume, and that's the grey line. And so we can see that in the flume trials that we did in the lab, like I just presented, she only raised her core temperature to just over 39 degrees. So there's possible issues there in terms of the location and what's actually happening in a race versus what we can actually simulate in the lab as well. And the blue line is another swimmer from that same event who swam just a 4K event. And then again, we still see that was a relatively modest rise for that swimmer. And both of these were in 28 degrees versus the 32 degrees that we had in our flume condition. Okay. So now we have the technology becoming available. So the picture there is of the new body cap core temperature pill system, which actually allows the data to be collected to the pill itself. So the swimmer, in this case, doesn't have to actually carry a monitor with them like previously, where to be able to monitor core temperature with the pill, we had to have a collection device or a monitor close to the person, where now these pills can actually log to themselves and we can download the data later. So it's becoming a lot easier that we can try and collect more field data like this, and I guess with the help probably of the physicians and the team support staff to get some more of this field data, because looking at the data we've seen here, it seems like a very important step for us to go. So in summary, of the 200 plus swims that we undertook, across the range of durations and temperatures, we didn't find anyone who was unable to really tolerate the higher water temperatures, and that the hypothermia they experienced was no more so than what we would see in terrestrial sports, and that there was a good relationship with how they actually perceived those temperatures and how comfortable they were as their temperature rose, and that their thermal behavior seemed to remain intact. We looked quickly at stroke kinematics using video and didn't see any major differences to be able to sort of predict or see if anyone was getting in trouble. And from those smaller side studies, we saw no risk associated with whether you're a faster swimmer, so if you're faster, you're not necessarily going to get hotter, whether you had just come off a recent high intensive training, so whether there's some sort of inflammatory state going on, didn't look like it was going to increase your risk. Wearing the wetsuit in 22 degrees and also the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle didn't seem to improve or increase any risk associated. Whoops. And lastly, obviously, the two significant caveats that we have from this is, as I say, the best place that we have to measure core temperature, so the rectal versus the esophageal data, and also what's happening in the field versus in the lab. So these are two main areas we really think more research is definitely warranted. I'll hand back to Jim.
Thanks, Carl. Just to clarify, when Carl was talking about the measurement technology for in the field, over the last 15 years, we've drowned several sets of core temperature monitoring systems, and it's only this year there's actually the body cap system available that it logs all of the data into the pill and then you just download it later, which is a much more satisfactory system, particularly for elite swimmers during competition, which is what we need. So I'm just going to finish off with some potential countermeasures for warm water and consider heat acclimation, hydration and pre-cooling, and we maybe can consider, and as I say, a coffee break if anyone's interested in the therapeutic effects of warm water. So as part of this, Carl actually ran another study where we took some of these swimmers, took 8 of the male swimmers, and subjected them to 7 one-hour swims per day in 33 degrees water and 33-degree air temperature, swimming basically as hard as they could for an hour every day. And then they did the control intensity match swims in pool temperatures. And then we measured performance in temperate environments, terrestrial environment, warm water, measured absolute blood volume before and after, and thermoregulatory function. And if we look at the results just expressed as standardized units, so benefit out there on the right, detriment on the left, the only clear result, apart from not getting any actual thermoregulatory adaptation, which is unsurprising for people swimming in warm water. So if people are choosing to swim in warm water as a method for heat acclimatization for performing in warm water, there's no clear evidence that it actually has any benefit. There's fairly clear trivial effect on performing in warm water and on performing in cool water. So using this as an ergogenic aid to compete in cooler water, which is becoming very much a topical interest for terrestrial athletes at the moment. And that contrasts with data from a research group that's done some very good work in swimming that many of you will probably know. It was a much less controlled study, but it was still ecologically quite valid. But they indicated improved performance. We don't actually know whether it's percent or seconds because the caption, the abstract, and the figures show different things. But we suspect that seconds improvement 10 and 30 days after coming back from 8 days of training or 7 days of training in the tropics versus training at altitude versus severe tapering. So what we sort of take from this is we don't really know, certainly combined with our data, and we've just published a counterpoint in the Journal of Physiology on this, where I was made to take the affirmative side, but I don't necessarily believe that. I think heat acclimation can help as an ergogenic aid for cool performance in some situations, some of the time for some people, but it's no panacea. So in that sense, I'd very much reiterate what Ron says in the nutritional sense. This is sort of icing on the cake stuff that may not be effective, and if you're going to use it, you have to know why you want to use it. So just to finish off with 2 other things, one on pre-cooling and then the other one on hydration. The obvious thing about minimizing thermal strain is be smart about the warm-up. It's potentially the most modifiable thing that there is, and particularly with increasing distance. Again, from the same data, from the same group, Hugh, and colleagues looking at actually this is drinking during a race, during training, 5K training, and it's in the evening swims when they're drinking 1 degree water during the race or during the training, they're keeping their core temperature down compared with 26 degree warmer water or drinking in the morning trials. If you want to pre-cool, a slushy is very thermodynamically efficient. It's 3 times more effective than having iced water. So if you want to cool down, there are definitely ways to do it. But bear in mind, and now the data at the bottom there, if you have a slushy, you're likely to go to a higher core temperature. So you have to be aware that you may be fooling your own thermostat. So for doctors and sports scientists, you have to be aware that you may be tripping up your own behavioural thermoregulation, and therefore you have to be responsible for that if something happens. Hydration, in these trials we had high sweat rates in the warm water, which makes sense. These may be underestimations because of the swallowing, and the swallowing, if it's salt water, has very intriguing effects for hydration, as Carl was saying. So there is clear logic to be rehydrating at tolerable levels, and most of the international guidelines would say that should be between about 400 and 800 mils an hour. I'll skip the therapeutic effects in the interest of time and just summarise to say, if you want to heat acclimate for swimming in hot water, by all means it's probably effective, and it should be balanced against things like how much warm-up you do, but it's unlikely to be that effectively achievable by swimming in hot water and warm water. And there may be no ergogenic effect on average for people taking that back to performances in cooler water. There's logical things to do before a race. At the moment, there's actually no real evidence supporting probiotics as an anti-pyrogenic effect. Limit the warm-up, consider pre-cooling, certainly consider hydration, and during the race, hydration, and heed the internal calls for how warm you think you are. And we'll skip the health benefits. And thank you for your... Oh well, never mind. It's only an acknowledgement slide, but thanks for your attention.